who's going to be leading this whole session. You'll see you have a packet with a lot of information about the shelter system that he's going to go through for the first 30 minutes. But then we're going to break out into our tables and have discussions and look at some case studies because the point of this training, as those of us who are actually engaged in the work on a regular basis, is for us to do our work with more empathy, to treat people with more dignity, to have better understanding of the individuals that we're directly working with. And so this is going to be kind of a workshop situation where we can practice some of what we've learned together. So without further ado, here's Josiah Dixon.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So this is going to be a data dump. I hope you guys are ready to drink from a fire hose. I have my trusty whiteboard here, so I'm going to be drawing up. I've been doing outreach, some of you know, with New York City Relief for 8 years now. And when I first started, I was walked through the shelter system and private options and all this stuff over the course of time. And I sort of, in that process, developed a picture of what the process looks like and how we can help folks navigate it effectively. So just in your package, just so you know what's there, and then I'm going to dive into kind of, again, this is going to be really content heavy. The first workshop we did was more philosophical and theological in terms of the why and the how. This is going to be, this is going to leapfrog off of that into more technical information. And again, the simple reason is this. The process of getting a place to stay when you have no money and you have no way of getting there is not easy. That might be the understatement of the night. The process of getting a place to stay that's free and that's available, that you can actually use as a sort of the mental picture I have in my head is sort of like a buoy in the ocean, right? A place that you can kind of cling to while you're trying to stay above the water. That buoy is very challenging. It's very there's complications to it. There's variables. There's all these factors because the point of what we're trying to help people do and what the city is trying to do and what we're trying to do and what everyone's trying to do is get people housing. Right? Like if you go to Coalition for the Homeless's website, and we talked about this last time. Remember, if you're here, you'll remember that I mentioned that the housing wage, the average housing wage in 2017 was $21 an hour. In order to have a housing wage, in order to pay for housing, the average wage is about $21 an hour, and the average hourly wage is about $16.38. So there is this discrepancy between what people are bringing in on an hourly basis and their ability to pay for the housing that they need. And we also know in New York City that housing is ridiculously expensive, specifically in New York City. So it's not so for example, you'll hear this term, and there's, by the way, there's a glossary of terms in your packets that have links. And the first term on the top of that page is housing first. Some of you know this term very well. Housing first is this methodology, is this philosophy that says that we need to get people housed before we start worrying about all the other factors that go into their homelessness or their struggle or their trauma or their mental health. We got to get people housed. And New York City, as a municipality, believes in housing first. Housing first is the philosophy of DHS. There's the mayor's office. The assumption is that we need to get people housed first. The problem is that there just isn't enough housing. And the cost of living is so ridiculous that there's no incentive for low-income housing to just magically appear. Which means you have all of these organizations that are trying to move towards this housing first model, but there just isn't enough housing available to go around. And so it ends up creating this sort of backlog where there are all these people that qualify for housing but just can't get access to it. So housing first is something it works. It's an approach that works. I also would argue philosophically that it's probably not a magic bullet. You can't just shove someone into an apartment and all of a sudden all their problems go away. However, it certainly beats the heck out of having them sleep on the sidewalk. So I would advocate for that, and we need to get more low-income housing. We need to get all of this stuff, and New York City definitely is trying to work towards that. But again, just the dynamics of this city make it challenging. And like I said, the cost, the wages, the jobs, everything factors into it. So that which ultimately leaves you guys and me feeling rather helpless, I think, a lot of times, right? We feel like we can't, what can we do for the person who's on the sidewalk? What can we actually connect them to? What resources are available to them? And that's what I'm going to walk you through tonight in terms of what is available, what options are out there. And so hopefully the reason and the point of this, in connection to what I talked about the first week, is that you guys can then play a critical role as that, like I said, that buoy that someone can actually hold on to. So you guys as volunteers and as staff and as organizational leaders, you can then function as that anchor, well, I'm mixing metaphors, but Jesus did it all the time, so you can't judge me too harshly, okay? If it was good enough for Jesus to mix metaphors, I can mix metaphors too. Get off my back, okay? But the point being is that you guys can then play a critical role in helping someone through the process, maybe while they're waiting for that housing to kick in. Or the other problem is this, if housing is the goal, so if the goal is actually to get people housed, how do we help them through the process and the hoops and the bureaucratic checks and systems so that they can actually make it to the other side? So for me, I'm going to end up drawing something that looks kind of like a giant funnel on this board. And some of you, it's going to maybe look kind of silly, and you may not even be able to see it. Forgive me later. But I'm going to put housing as the ultimate goal, right? When it comes to homelessness, we want to get people housed. Is that spelled right? H-O-U-S-I-N-G. Yes, never said I was good at spelling. Never claimed that. And before I jump into the meat of it, I also want to reiterate this. I am not actually, and I said this before, you heard me say this like a dozen times if you're here the first week, I am not a housing expert. Okay, there are people here who actually work in this field and know way more about housing than I do. I am not a mental health practitioner. I am not someone who is an expert in, I can't help you fill out a 2010E housing application. I can't do a psych eval or a psych social. I can't do any of those things. And there are people here who can, and really you guys should lead your own workshop at another time that goes into maybe more details about that. But what I can say is that what I have done is I've tried to, over the last 8 years, is help people navigate and connect to the places that will actually help them provide those things, and that's what I'm going to go into right now. So, housing is the goal for men and women who are experiencing homelessness. Look at my time. All right. There are basically overall there are basically three sort of pathways or avenues for the person who is on the street. So you have someone on the street who has no place to sleep and no way to get there and no way to pay for it. What are their options? What can they do? So the question that you can ask someone when you see them on the street or if they come up and ask you for help, a very common and very helpful question is, do you have a place to sleep tonight? It's a very simple question. It's not very intrusive. Do you have a place to sleep tonight? You're not inviting that person into your home. You're not bringing, you're just asking, does this person have a place to sleep tonight? And if they're like, no, I'm on the sidewalk, or I'm sleeping at Penn Station or whatever, then you know that they have three basic, initially, you have DHS is one of your primary options. Department of Homeless Services, New York City is a right to shelter city. What does that mean? What that means is that if you are in New York City and you actually don't have a place to sleep, and you can prove, it's kind of important, but if you can prove on some level that you are in acute need for a place to sleep, you actually have a right in the 5 boroughs to a bed in one of the municipal shelters. So you have the DHS public option. I made those funnels too wide.
Can we ask questions now or wait?
So, sorry, thank you. We're going to have a whole time of Q&A towards the back end. So if you, that's the other thing. In your packets, I made a page for notes. So you can write down questions on your notes as they come up, and then when we break, and then we're going to have time for Q&A. So I'm going to do another 15 minutes of data dump, or 20 minutes of data dump, and then we can do questions after that. That's all right with you. So DHS, how does that work? Well, if you're in a city shelter, if you're a single man, you have to go to Bellevue. So the single men in New York City will end up going through Bellevue, typically, which is an intake shelter. Because here's the catch. A lot of you know that there are shelters located all over the city, and the question becomes, why can't I just send someone directly to the shelter? There's a shelter right around the corner from my house. Most of you know buildings that are shelters. But guess what? You can't send anyone there. You can't send anyone directly to the shelter that's in your neighborhood. You actually have to send them through the intake process so that they can funnel through and get placed into the shelter. So, and if you're a single adult man and you're not in a shelter and you're sleeping in the street, you can't just go to the shelter down the road. You have to go to the intake center, which is in Bellevue. If you're a single female, you're going to be ending up going to Franklin in the Bronx. Franklin in the Bronx, there's another place, and all this information is in your packet as well, so you don't have to do all the nitty-gritty as far as what I'm writing. But there's another place in Brooklyn. But basically, again, intake. You're going through the intake center. If you're a family with kids, you're going to go to PATH in the Bronx. If you're couples, if you're just a couple with no kids, you're going to go through AFIC, which is near Bellevue. But the point being, this is an avenue that you can go for intake into a shelter in New York City. And this is how it works, intake. That's the first step. But like I said, what did I say before about qualifying, right? I said if you're in New York City and you need shelter, you have to have some measure of proof in order to qualify for said shelter. Now again, it's not as simple as that. So if you work for DHS and you're sitting here and you're like, okay, it's not hold on. I'm speaking in generalities here. But the fact is that your right to shelter is contingent on the need for that shelter. So what they're going to do when you go into intake is they're going to do a process that once upon a time, I don't know if it's still called this may not be the latest information, but there's a process called, that I was introduced to when I took a tour of Bellevue many years ago, of diversion. Because here's the thing, there are over 63,000 people in the New York City shelter system currently. You can check the stats on the website. Every night, 63,000. The reality is that there's just not a lot of space. The shelters are full. They're trying to build more. They're trying to contract more. They're trying to figure out a way to get more beds available. So if you have a right to shelter and you have all these people coming to shelter, the goal is to actually divert people away from the shelter system. So you're going to call, if you go in through Bellevue or if you go through Franklin, it's not going to be a very easy process. You're not talking about, so when you're talking to the guy on the street that you meet, right? Say, let's call him Ethan. I had a really good friend who was homeless for many years, who passed away in 2018 in the street, who was just a great friend. His name was Ethan. And he was in the street for many, many years, and if I wanted him to go into the shelter, I would have to send him through Bellevue, where he would hit the process of diversion, where they would try to find a friend, a neighbor, a cousin, uncle, relative, someone who will say, no, he can stay with me. Because guess what? As soon as that person says he can stay with me, he no longer is required by DHS to be placed in a shelter because he has alternative housing. This is now someone who does no longer qualifies under the right to shelter process because the person now has been diverted. The problem though that you run into, and if you talk to anybody who's gone through this process, is that process is a little bit painstaking. It's kind of horrible. It's kind of a difficult process because you're trying to find your way through the system. You have to go through like the metal detectors. You have to go through this huge interview process. There's a lot of waiting, a lot of standing around. And there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable in that setting, and so they get stressed out and they leave and they get frustrated. So there's a lot of people in the street who will not go into shelter precisely because they have tried maybe and they hit the diversion mark or they hit the intake process and they stop. Because I'm not going to go any farther, I'm not going back to Bellevue, I'm not doing it. So, if they're going through there, then you have the process of, if you manage to make it through the intake, make it through the diversion, make it through the process and they determine, yes, you need shelter, now they're going to try to place you. Okay, so they're going to try and place you in one of the shelters somewhere in the city. Again, right to shelter means that you have to have a bed, but it doesn't mean you have a right to a shelter in a specific area. It doesn't mean that if you're in the Bronx, you are guaranteed a bed in a shelter in the Bronx. You could end up somewhere else. Now again, the city is trying to change, they're doing the best they can, trying to place people in geographic areas, but this is what led to those stories. Some of you guys remember the news stories about the kids who were on the bus for 3.5 hours just to get to school in the shelter? Because they're getting placed in a shelter in Queens, and they're going to school in the Bronx or someplace, and they have to do like 2 buses and 2 trains, and so because they got placed somewhere, because they went through the intake path, got placed, and then they did placement. And the placement process, now you can be in any shelter, anywhere. Oh, I'm also not an artist. Chelsea's an artist, I'm not. But those are shelters. So you get placed in a shelter, and there's usually a temporary, it's initially, from my experience, it's usually a temporary, what they would call placement shelter, where you're actually being sort of evaluated. Because again, the goal is housing. And there are different qualifications for housing. Like so, there's and this is all in your packet, but you have supportive housing, you have independent, you have low income housing, you have people with disabilities, you have veterans, you have people who qualify because they're HIV positive for HASA. You have all these qualifications that sort of form into this application process known as the 2010E, which is a housing application that you have to fill out, and it involves a psychosocial, it involves this exam that you have to, all this paperwork, and it has to be current. So the goal for the process of the shelter system is to get people into the placement shelter temporarily, where they can then hopefully get a 2010E application filled out, hopefully get the psychosocial, hopefully get the process, so they can hopefully apply for housing. So here's the problem. 63,000 people in the shelter system, you have caseworkers who are overloaded, you have floor people who have caseloads that are really unrealistic, you have people who are not getting these housing applications filled out. It's just a frustrating situation. I talked to one couple who was in the shelter for 3 years, never filled out a 2010E. And I'm sitting here going like, oh my goodness, how does that, and if you talk to anyone who works at DHS, they're going, yeah, that's ridiculous, it should never happen. They need to get the 2010E filled out because you need a psych eval, and if you're going to get a psych eval, it needs to be current. You can't actually turn in a psych eval from 2 years ago and expect that to qualify you for the housing. So if you do the psych eval, you do all the paperwork, you get everything filled out, but then you get stalled or you get delayed, then you end up, your psych eval sort of becomes expired, and then you go back and you say, I want to fill out where's my housing, I qualify, I fill out this application. You gotta go back to the beginning, you gotta go get a psych eval, and then you gotta get the so there's all these sort of hoops that you have to jump through and bureaucratic mess to sort of navigate. And again, the reason is good. The reason is so that they can qualify the people and get the people in the right housing, in the right place. So that's a good thing, but the problem is if you're gonna create a system that catches everybody, you need to be able to catch everybody, which is also frustrating if, say, you don't need a psych eval. Say you just lost your job and you're having like a really tough go at things because you're just having really a crappy month or a crappy year, and you're told by a social worker that you have to go get a psych eval before you can even apply for housing. And you're gonna be like, well, what the heck, I just lost my job, I don't wanna have to go do a psych eval. But the problem is, again, it's one system to catch everybody. It's like one ring to rule them all, right? One application to catch everybody. So you're trying to find a way to get people into that 2010E application, and that's during this temporary process. And then if you say, because if you're a veteran, you can get housing faster than if you're not. If you are a family, you can usually get housing faster than if you're just a single adult male of working age. If you're disabled, you can usually get housing faster than if you're not. And so they're trying to find housing, again, what I said at the very beginning, New York City, there's no housing. So they're trying to find these places, and places open up and fill and open up. It's like whack-a-mole, but like no fun, all right? So this is the process that we're trying to get placed into for the DHS system. And then, say they realize that they're not going to be able to get them housed quickly, then there's often the case, again, not always, but often the case where they would get placed in a more long-term shelter. Again, that's going to be different, and there's a lot of moving around. So if you're like moving from place to, you're like, the shelter system is not, again, you have a right to shelter, but you're not necessarily have a right to the same place, the same bed, the same building for the extended period of time. Except, once you get placed in that shelter, ooh, voice. Once you get placed in that shelter, say you get robbed. Say you get into a fight with a security guard. Say you get into a conflict with somebody. If you're placed in a shelter and then you're there, if you leave voluntarily or you get thrown out, you can't just go back to the beginning and start over. Even though you might think that's the best case scenario. Because what they're going to do is they're going to say, oh, you already have a place. go back to your shelter. You have to stay in the same place for up to a year. You can't move around. So I've had people tell me, and again, this is anecdotal, this isn't scientific, but I've had people tell me that it's easier to get moved if you're not safe in jail than if you're in the shelter. Because if someone's trying to kill you in jail, you just tell the guard and they move you a different block. If you're trying to get killed in a shelter, there's really not much you can do because you were placed in that shelter and you have it's a right to shelter, but it's not a right to any shelter you want, and it's not as easy as moving around. So moving from shelter to shelter is not, it's a cumbersome process. Then again, the goal still is hopefully, so if I meet someone on the street and they tell me that they've been placed in a shelter, they've filled out their 2010E, they have a caseworker who's a godsend, there are angels, I'm telling you, there are angels who work at shelters in New York City. There are angels who work at shelters in New York City, so you will never hear me say that, oh, the shelters are all terrible. Yes, it's a difficult situation, but there are people working there who are literally sent by God to be emissaries of His love. I don't know if that's a word, but there's angels there. So if you happen to get the angel who's working there, I have a friend whose name is Asaf. He's one of my favorite people in the world. He works in a shelter at DHS and places people in housing, and he is legitimately an angel. I know he's getting people housed as best he can, working within the system that he has. If I meet them in the street and they're in a shelter, I'm going to say, dude, don't go. Don't go. Don't leave. Work it out. Hang in there. Because the fastest way to housing, once you're already through this whole process, you're towards the end, but I can tell you, you don't know if this last stretch is going to be 6 days, 6 months, or you just don't know. Hopefully it's short, but you just don't know. But the fastest route, if you leave here, that's when you get into some sticky situations. So that's the DHS system in a nutshell. And again, there's more information you can ask. We're going to do a whole time of Q&A afterwards. The other option is this. You meet the guy on the street. I may see my friend Even. You have private options. So private options are non-state funded organizations that provide emergency shelter for people who are in the street. Usually the private options, the downside to them is that they are short-term. They are usually, I'm already running out of time, I'm sorry, I'm trying to push through this stuff. They're really short-term. So like the Bowery Mission is a great program that provides overnight shelter every night of the week. They're amazing, they have great, they have beds, they have showers, you can stay there, but you're not guaranteed an extended stay. So if you're in the street and you end up going to the Bowery Mission, you're going to end up, you have a temporary window where you're going to have to figure some things out, and if you work with them and you can get into the programs, and we're going to talk about the programs at another date, but if you can actually get a place to sleep, that's great, but you're not going to be able to stay there indefinitely. So like, it's not like you might get a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the most, unless you're doing like sleeping through the wintertime on a mat or something. But it's not like a long-term solution. It's like you're stalling. You're waiting, and you're in the process of waiting. All Angels Church provides shelter every Sunday night, and honestly, it's one of I've talked to people who stay here. It's one of their favorite places to stay. Genuinely, I'm not blowing smoke. This is actually one of people's favorite places to stay. But it's one night a week, right? It's just one night a week. So if you're trying to get housing and you need a place to sleep and you need like a buoy to hang on to while you're waiting for that ship to come and pick you up and take you to the Bahamas, it's a temporary fix. So private options. Again, I have a lot of information. You have like the Rescue Alliance, New York City Rescue Alliance is a number of partners that are private options that provide help. New York City Relief is a part of that Rescue Alliance. We try to help people get connected to these shelters. Catholic Charities, Queen of Peace is another one up in the Bronx that they provide shelter for men. And there's a shelter for women in Harlem. It's Missionaries of Charity. Again, that's like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's not a long-term solution. So if you're trying to get housing, it gets a little bit dicey if you're going through this process and then you jump out of that process into this process, because now you may actually get like steamrolled. You may actually end up in this loop of short-term solutions. So they're great, but they're short-term, okay? The other options for people to move towards housing is you have the outreach process. So this is like the New York City Outreach like the New York City Outreach Consortium. You've seen them out there, BRC, Breaking Ground, QCS, Goddard. These are amazing organizations that are sending outreach teams. So if you call 311, when you see a homeless person or see someone in the street, they're going to send an outreach team to that person. That outreach team is going to work probably for one of those organizations, and their concept is to try to get people housed as quickly as they can through a process that qualifies them for housing that usually involves chronic time, like time lapses. So you'll end up having to see someone over the course of 6 to 9 months in that geographic vicinity. You could go through a drop-in center. You can have, so if you go into the drop-in center, they'll end up connecting you to a street outreach team. If you go through the emergency shelter network, some of you guys know about, because they have church beds that provide shelter for people if they go through the drop-in centers, and then they get connected. So there's ways of getting that person off the street. Again, but they're not necessarily, unless they're working with a caseworker or they're working with the outreach teams for those organizations, their goal is to then get someone to fill out the 2010E or to establish a case manager for that person to end up getting them into a safe haven or some other shelter or housing situation, depending on that person's unique scenario. So you have these other processes that are trying to get people fill out the 2010E, get case management, get established a place where they can stay, all with the goal, again, of going towards housing in the process. So there's a sheet in your packet that I included that we got from New York City Relief is a part of this consortium known as HSU. It's Housing Homeless Services United, and we work with. Again, we get to sit around the table with organizations like CUCS and Breaking Ground and Goddard. These are amazing, amazing organizations. However, again, you're talking about a massive, if you flip through your packet and you get to the page that's really, 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 really complex. It looks, I can't even explain it to you. It's basically 6 different charts in one, put together. God bless the person who tried to puzzle that together based on the information that they had in front of them. The reason why I included that is not because I want you to understand it, because I don't fully. The reason I included that is because, again, I want you guys to remember when you see that guy on the sidewalk, it is unlikely that he chose homelessness, even if he says he's choosing homelessness, right? The fact is that if someone tells you they're choosing homelessness, imagine that you're taking a multiple choice test and the test is your life. Your life is a multiple choice test. You have A, B, C, or D. Letter D is homeless, sleeping on the sidewalk, sleeping at Penn Station. I'd like you to tell me what A, B, and C look like. Genuinely. If you think choosing option D is what is the best option you have, it's because you think that A, B, and C are worse. It's not because you want to be out there in the street. It's not because you're looking for the free life of not having any responsibility, even if that's what you think you're doing. It's because you genuinely don't think you have any alternatives that are actually better. And part of that reason is because of that piece of paper that I showed you and part of this process. Part of the challenge is that the process is just this complex. So for you as a volunteer, can you just imagine someone that you've met who is, because I know if you're in this room, you've almost certainly met someone who's homeless or been homeless yourself. And so you understand that the challenges that people are dealing with are vast. And you understand that processing through DHS or getting into a private shelter and then connecting to a caseworker who's going to connect you to a housing, who's going to connect you to a job, connect you to mental health, connect you to 2010E, which is then hopefully going to eventually get you to housing. The paths that lead to housing are all very, 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 very challenging. So, who is going to make it to housing and who isn't? The person who's not going to make it to housing, the person who's not going to make it, the person who's going to end up unfortunately, even in some cases, even with friends and with connections. But the point is the person who's going to die out there in the street is the person who's completely and utterly alone. The person who doesn't have an advocate, who doesn't have a friend, who doesn't have someone who is rooting for them, checking on them, pulling for them, believing in them, and helping encourage them every step of the way. And so you guys as volunteers, the best thing I can do, piggybacking off of the culture of dignity and moving into this session, is I wanted you guys to see this and see the information that I have in the packet so that when you see that person in the street, you can know that you might be the difference between the person making it and not. And it's probably not because you're going to be the one filling out the paperwork. It's probably going to be because you're going to be the one who asks them kind of where they are in the process and how they're doing with it. All right.
Your bed is available for someone else, but if you're not going to be there for 2 days, then someone could. You know what I mean?
That's exactly what they need.
Yeah.
The city council's about 95% of them call bad stuff. What do you mean to say?
Well, so I have a question. So have you heard of like pods? Like there's hotel pods.
What?
No, pods. Like P-O-D-S, pod. It's like there's hotels where if one person goes into like a rectangular kind of unit and they might have their bathroom in there and a bed and it's just like that for you.
Let's regroup.
And then you have your own door, but it's like
You guys are having splendid conversations. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have you can nominate a representative from your table. But we're going to have you share one thing, like I said, and then we're going to move right into sort of a Q&A. So I have found something with Q&As in the past that it's either feast or famine. Either people just have tons of questions and they're super interactive and they ask lots of really good things, or they all just stand there and stare at me. And they're like, oh no, we're good, we got it. And so then it's just really awkward, because I booked like an hour for this. So this is forcing the issue by having you guys actually forced sharing time. So as a follower of Jesus, I believe the last shall be first. So I would normally start with 1, but we're going to start with the other highest number. What number is the highest? What do we have here, table number wise? 11 here? All right, we'll start with 11. So like one thing, or the case study interest, it can be simple, it can be a question, it can be a statement.
How many are we maxed out to?
How many
Questions or observations?
For now, let's just do 1 for each, and then after that, we'll open it up to everybody. So you can ask more if you have other questions.
Sure. So we have an observation rather than a question, but the person's story that we were reading, he began very stable. He had a job. He didn't have any substance abuse problems, but it went from stability to instability fairly quickly. But there were multiple points in the story where if there was some person who had a little bit of extra knowledge, it would have made a huge difference.
Can I repeat that for everybody?
Yes, please.
So what she's saying is that this case study that they looked at, the person went from stability to instability really fast. Like it was like a really quick transition. And she was saying that what they discussed was that if there was somebody in their life who had expertise or had knowledge or had the ability to intervene with that person during that period from instability to stability, that may have actually interrupted the slide.
Yeah,
is that right?
We noticed as well, kind of tailing on that the point in his story when he actually had a breakthrough and he was able to get services, it was when a team contacted him. So that kind of led us to make the observation that it's really helpful when you are building friendships with people who need help. It's good to be in community with other people who are doing the same thing and have access to other knowledges.
Yes. So what she said was that when the person did actually get breakthrough in their situation, it was because there was a team of people that were able to intervene with that person. So having access to a community or having access to multiple people, and this is something that I think, just to piggyback off that, is that from my observation from working in New York City Relief for these last 8 years, is that one of the best things you can ask someone is if they have a caseworker that they're working with. Corey and I were talking about someone that he met at Starbucks who was saying he was working with breaking ground, and the question then becomes, as an ally, how can you, like what I've done sometimes, I say, well, would this be someone that I could meet with, or that you'd want me to connect with, not so that you can tell, it's very important, not so you can tell them how to do their job, okay, but so that you can add extra support and find out if there's anything that you can do directly in contact with that caseworker to form a team, because it often takes, people are overworked and there's a lot of needs, so even forming that team, I think, is a really good observation. Thank you, and we'll, again, come back for more questions if you have them. Table 10.
Hi. So our takeaway, it has to do with the importance of human connection. So we had a woman who had, great economic circumstances that were pretty immediately taken away from her. She had this huge shock and didn't want to tell anybody what had happened. So ends up in dire straits. And so we were thinking about how important it is to make clear to people when we talk to them that their value is not in what they have and what their home is, to treat them as a full, robust human person. But we also had a really deep-seated desire for her to get back in connection with people. And we weren't quite sure the best way to do that. We were like, well, we want to call our kids, like her kids are overseas and things like this. And we're like, our desire is to not only have connection with her, but to help her reforge those connections. We were trying to figure out how that we might do that.
Yeah, so helping people reforge their connections with family members or with those, because the human connection is so important. Because homelessness is I shared this the first night, it's intrinsically lonely and isolation, it's very isolating. It's an isolating experience. And if someone if they have family or friends, this is something that, again, I've observed with our team. There's a way of being tactful. You can't bully someone or tell someone you need to call your daughter. If there's a lot of trauma there's a lot of pain, you can't force the issue. But if you establish human connection, I know there's someone that came to our outreach for about a year, and he was establishing connection with one of our staff members, and over that time they became friends, and he shared about his daughter. And they shared about his daughter, and shared about his daughter, and eventually, though, they got to a point where she's like, tell me more about your daughter. And even just by saying, tell me more about that daughter, they start talking about her, or what happened, and there might be, through that one connection, there might be a way to say, because what we did in that situation, we actually had the person we called for that person, because they were just too ashamed, and there was a lot of trauma there in that relationship, but there was so much trust between the outreach leader that we were working with and the person, that the person was like, you can call my daughter for me and tell them I'm alive, tell them I made the established connection. And we've had a situation where that person on the other end of the phone said, thank God you called, tell him to come home. Wow. Tell him to come home. So you have those situations where even there's some misunderstanding between the family, where the daughter has been all these years just another gentleman I met at the rescue mission, 90 Lafayette Street, who was telling me that he ended up talking to him for just a few minutes, and he said, call my sister. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to be so weird. I don't know, I barely knew, I just met you. He's like, no, call, and he clearly was in distress, mental distress. He's like, call my sister. So I called his sister, I was like, hi, I work at New York City Relief. I just met a guy who says he's your brother. I don't know. And she's like, oh yeah, he's my brother. Tell him to come home. And I was like, well, would you be willing to come get him? Pick him up? You're in Connecticut, he's in Manhattan. Can you come drive in and get him? She's like, no, I can't. I'm with my kids or whatever. She's like, but if he gets to the train station, so we ended up buying him a train ticket and getting him home, and I was, again, expecting everything to go wrong because I'm a bit cynical. But then I got a text message the next day from her saying, thank you, my brother made it. So now there's obviously cases where it doesn't work out, but I think you're onto something. I think that's where having that established and that connection of trust of saying, so that person who had that family, that they may not have even thought of. So yeah, I think that's a great observation. Thank you. I'm going to keep going. I talk too much. I'm sorry. 10, 11, 10, 9.
So our situation is a young girl, 18, who is battered and bruised, doesn't want to go to a shelter. Well, she wants a regular place in a homeless shelter and money to buy the morning after pill. Mm-hmm. And so it goes into all the details that she doesn't want to talk about things. She's nervous and frightened. She's agitated and tearful. Just basically, she's got physical abuse. We're not sure if it's possibly be sexual abuse. Obviously, there's been something because she wants the morning after pill. But she's she even makes the fact that she even brings up the case that she doesn't want to go to a shelter where there are mixed male and female. She wants a women-only shelter. One of the And then when she's asked if she would be comfortable checking into a domestic violence shelter, she's hesitant. But that was kind of our, I guess, our best outcome for her, in that we felt like in a domestic violence shelter, there's been some sort of abuse. And it does mention that mother's boyfriend is she's a runaway, and mother's boyfriend is one of the reasons why, but she won't talk about that. So it's like there's all these situations that point to, obviously, she's being violated in some way, probably sexually. She's obviously been violated. She's obviously been physically abused. We don't know if there's sex on the street for drugs. We don't know all of that. It just gives scenarios. But we just kind of felt like going to that domestic violence shelter would take care of two things. A, it would be a female-only shelter. And B, because it's domestic violence, it would very likely have physicians that could examine and take care of the medical need and the morning after pill and that kind of thing, if she were willing to do that.
Yeah. One of the things I've observed in that situation, I've talked to several people in that exact scenario situation, and so as you're talking to that person, again, if someone's specifically for me, right, as a guy, this is something that as you're walking around in the street, I would say just know your context and where you're coming from. So like if I approached that woman on the street, she would probably respond very negatively and wouldn't open up, wouldn't tell me a thing, and maybe I would walk away from that thinking, wow, what's her problem? If I'm not aware, if I'm not self-aware, because there's a lot of abuse and a lot of assault that happens for women who are in the street. So just knowing kind of even maybe if you see someone in that situation, I'd say like having a woman approach that person, and then again establishing that human connection. Because I've also found that like if someone is being abused or someone is like, you can also not necessarily, just so you guys know, like there are numbers and hotlines and things that you can call on behalf of people if you think that person is in an unsafe situation. You can call 311. You can, even if you think it's urgent, you can actually call 911 for someone if someone's physically, like if someone's got, bleeding or someone, like you can, like this is where being a citizen and being a neighbor can be really helpful. And I think a lot of times we just assume that person doesn't really want to be bothered with that, or I don't want to get involved, or I don't know the story, I don't know what's true and what's not. I would just encourage you to just be aware that as a citizen, it's okay to base whether you call or not on your observation. If you see someone who's in acute distress, you see someone who's really not doing well, it's like worst case scenario is you call and they don't find her, you call and nothing happens, but the best case scenario is that maybe they actually are able to get help, maybe in domestic violence or the hotline for domestic violence. I know Safe Horizons does a lot of great work. And in your packet, there's a link specifically about domestic violence that can lead to even more resources about that. So yeah, it's a great approach. 8.
Yes. So we discussed the case of it similar to Table 10, and I would say we really focused on the first question about what contributed to the homelessness and sort of what kind of elder care interventions could have been helpful. And so we were really struck by the impact that isolation had on the woman and the pride and the shame and the fear that affected the decisions that she was making. And so we started asking this question, we thought about the lack of a social network, and then we started asking this question actually in a preventative way, like what would it look like to plan for emergencies for all of us before, to think ahead, I guess, about before a situation like this even happens, and not just financially, but socially, right? Before you're in the midst of the trauma, that you perhaps thought about your social network and who you can call and say, I'm really inclined, and I like when you've already sort of said, I'm going to call you and I'm not going to deal with the pride or the shame, or I don't have to deal with that, right? And so we thought about what would that look like to think and plan for that, if that's even possible. And then the other, and I think that just lends itself to thinking about the mental health support that's so essential in helping people make decisions and connecting them with that kind of just the ability to be honest and to let it go and to let out all of the stigma and the stress that surrounds our ability to move forward.
There are surprisingly few free counseling services, outpatient for homeless individuals. So this is something I discovered in trying to help people. Like there's some people you meet on the street who genuinely, they're not ready to go into shelter necessarily. They're not ready to fill out the 2010E. They're not ready to maybe go to church on Sunday or connect with, but they might actually be willing to sit down with a counselor or someone in a one-on-one basis. So like if anyone feels like starting a triage mobile counseling service, this is your call to action. I think that there is some value in even just like we are getting to a point now where we offer mobile like medical services where doctors will go out into the street and provide sort of like triage services for their like cuts and bruises, and they'll do like even having mobile like therapeutic counselors to like just go out and make friends. I mean, in a way, that's kind of what New York City Relief does not offer therapeutic services. We are not claiming, we're not billing anybody. But like, the point being that there's value so much. I've talked to so many people where I'm like, man, I'd love to just give this guy a phone number and say, hey, make an appointment with these people. And just go in for free. You don't know what it costs. Just make an appointment, go in and sit down and talk to somebody for an hour. Because how many of us are benefiting from counseling and therapeutic services and we have a bed to sleep in the night? How much more would we benefit if someone maybe has someone to talk to? So I think that's a great mental health piece, and all that stuff is really good. Thank you. All right, 7.
We had, I think, the same case study as table 9, about the young woman. What really stuck out to us was, considering the urgency of the issue presented, had you quickly build trust? I mean, very understandably, she's kind of hesitant and guarded, not wanting to go into details about what happened the night before. But in order to help her most efficiently, we need to know as much info as possible.
Yeah.
And so, walking that fine line of not pushing, really pushing her away, but also being able to find out the information we need to know.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, building trust quickly is almost an oxymoron. It's like a paradox. However, I do think that this goes back to the first session we talked about in terms of building a culture of dignity. I think your environment where you meet that person and the context that you meet someone in will lend us. Now again, there are people, this is where I'm going to default back to the point I made earlier. I'm not an expert, I'm not a mental health practitioner. But from my experience doing outreach, when you have like triaging someone quickly, the environment that you are able to build around that person where you meet them is really important. So if you meet someone on the street, so just for example, not invading their space, not immediately defaulting to fixing their problem, not immediately saying, not just making decisions for that person. So like I've had situations where I'm like, listen, I'm not doing anything that you don't want me to do. I'm not like just establishing the boundaries up front. Like, no, this is you're in charge. You're in charge. In situations where you're talking to somebody and there's so many walls up and there's so many people telling them what they should do, telling them what they need. Even like I mentioned earlier, like calling, if you're going to call for help, and sometimes if it's an acute situation, it's often best to do it after you walk away from like again, establishing trust. If you feel you need to call, but in certain instances, if you're trying to establish trust, you don't necessarily want to tear down that trust and make that person think that you're just trying to get them locked up in a mental hospital. Which I'm sure in a lot of folks' case who are homeless, that's what people have tried to do. People have tried to tell them you're broken, you need mental help, you need to go into the hospital, you need. So actually establishing those, I found that when you're in the street and you're talking to somebody, establishing trust looks like creating an environment where you allow that person to be in charge of that situation. So you're like, look, I'm just asking how you're doing. I'll tell hopefully a quick story, because we still have more tables to get to. But I met a woman, I was in West Harlem, and I had a passerby was walking down the street, and they actually pulled me aside, and they said, there's a young lady sitting in the street, it was pouring down rain. It was like absolutely pouring down rain. And she's like, there's a young lady sitting in the street who looks like she needs help. And then they kept walking. I was like, great, all right. So I walked up the street and I found there's like these, I was on 145th Street, And there's these cars parked on the side of the road, and in between the two cars was a young lady who was probably ages 16 to 20, sitting there with all of her possessions in a black garbage bag, looking very, really just like the world, she's just literally sitting in the rain, staring off into space. And I was like, excuse me, are you doing okay? Like, what's going on? She looked up and yeah, I'm okay. And I was like, you're getting soaking wet. Would you like to come over to the relief? Like, we have this bus, we have these tents, we have this great environment. We'd love to have you come and sit and get out of the rain. She's like, no, I don't want to come. I'm okay. And I was like, okay, things don't look okay. I'm not telling you what to do, but things don't look okay. Are you sure I can't get you something? And anyway, she's like, no, I'm okay. And there was this like hotel that was right there. It's really like kind of those cheap hotels that people stay at. And she just looked like she was in a bad spot. So I ended up going back to the bus, getting some socks and some hygiene kit. And I came back and I was like, look, because at this point it's tough, because if she's telling me she's okay, even if I call and she finds out I called, she leaves. So I was just in this tough spot. And I was also new at the time, so I probably was a little bit nervous about calling when I didn't. Looking back, I probably should have called. That was probably something I absolutely should have done, but I missed it. But God is merciful. So I ended up handing her my business card, and I was like, hey, here's socks, hygiene kit, and here's my card. If I can help you in any way, just call me. And she took my card, she said thank you, but she didn't move. And it was like this just bizarre, it was pouring down rain. So I get a call at 2 in the morning from an unknown number, and she tells me it's the girl that you met on 145th Street, could you call me back? I called her at 6 a.m., found out that she got a hold of her after playing phone tag, and she said she was with a guy who she didn't feel safe with, and she needed help, and I ended up somehow I just watched this documentary about GEMS. Have you guys heard of GEMS? Yes. It's this amazing organization that does, actually I haven't been in touch with them in years, but they, so I ended up saying, I was like, are you familiar with this place? And again, it was a God moment, because I had just watched this documentary, I met her, mentioned it sort of randomly, which was probably not something I normally would have done, and she's like, actually I stayed there, and I left, and I'm worried they won't take me back. I was like, well, why not let me, I said, can I just call them? I said, can I reach you at this number? She said, yes, absolutely, call me, reach me at this number. I said, if they will let you go back, will you go back? And she said, yes, I would love to go back. I just don't think they'll take me back. So I said, okay, just let me call you back. I literally Googled GEMS, and I called the 800 number, and I got the executive director on the phone. Wow. No idea how that happened. She just answered the phone. I don't know if she was just like passing through that day or what happened, but she just answered the phone, and I was like, hi, I'm with New York City Relief. I have a woman who said that she was in your program, and now she's not, and she's worried that she can't go back. And she said, absolutely, we will take her back. Wow. Give me, and I was like, I'm like always stretching, can you go get her? Kind of like the woman in the system. Can you come pick her up? It's always, it shows you how lazy I am. I was like, can you come pick her up? And she's like, yeah, we'll send somebody. She said, give me the number. So I ended up calling the girl back and said, hey, you're going to get a call. And anyway, I didn't end up hearing what happened, because I obviously didn't have a release form signed or any consent. So they called back and they're like, who are you? But who knows? So in that situation, I think sometimes giving people the freedom to establish that they're in charge, you're not going to make them do anything, and you sometimes can, even just by saying, hey, I'm worried about you, sometimes that's enough to establish trust really fast. Instead of just being all like pleasantries, like actually saying, I'm worried about you, I'm concerned about you. Because how many people don't have anyone who's concerned about them? Sorry, that was a long story, long comment. 6. 7, 6.
Okay, so we had a man who quickly spiraled down in homelessness and just really showed a lack of knowledge. And so what we came up with is that lack of education of resources is a huge barrier. And it's not just lack of information, but because we all are on the subways, we see the signs and everything like that. But what was pointed out very wisely is that you can make big impact with relationship. And I know a lot of people have also talked about it's that human connection. I think that just shows the point so much. You are the most effective not just because we have a list of things people will do, but when you meet people where they are, and to show them that they're loved and that they're worthy of this information. But so much,
Yeah, it's good.
so many of us don't have it.
Yeah, that's good. Absolutely. It's absolutely accurate. At least, again, from what I can tell. Number 5.
All right, well, we had a lot of very good conversation, and none of it had anything to do with the case.
That's all good.
A theme that came up, or a concern that I think a lot of us shared, was that as much as we want to help, but we really don't, out of a lack of wisdom or understanding, want to make things worse. And a specific scenario that we're curious about would be, you're encouraging someone to go to a government organization where they're apparently a very thorough investigation is now done, which would potentially reveal if that person was wanted in some regard, undocumented. There are various ways that jeopardy could attach by a person seeking assistance, and it seems like it would be reasonable to know before you advise somebody what their options are, what the potential fallout could be. So, are there firewalls between DHS and any of the other governmental organizations that might have competing interests?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I don't even know if there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think there's probably my guess, and maybe someone else can answer this better than I can. I think there's probably a case-by-case, in the sense that I know that there have been people who've told me that they don't actually report or anything like that. But I've also heard rumors about like ICE hanging out outside homeless shelter intake centers and stuff. So I think in that situation, not knowing all the details, and especially not knowing even what that person's background might be, and what you might be what they might, like, so I know they do, like, at least they used to. Again, I haven't gone, maybe even I don't know if Sebastian or Joe haven't gone into the intake recently in terms of just visiting there, but they used to do fingerprinting. I believe they still do fingerprinting. So in and of itself, that alone is a scary situation if you have a record, if you're undocumented, if you're in a perilous situation. So the best thing I could say is, what I've found is to warn people ahead of time about the experience, which is kind of what the point of tonight is in a way, is for us to understand kind of what the dynamics in terms of the intake process. Like, again, I wasn't able to go into detail. You can always dig in more. But if you know more about what the process looks like, you can prep them for what they're going to experience, which then they can decide, okay, I know that I'm undocumented, I know that I'm scared, I know that that's not a good situation. Maybe a private option is a better option, because I know that, I know the Bowery Mission, I know Queen of Peace, I know the nuns up at Missionaries Charity, they're not doing no background checks, so they're not connected to the database. So in that situation, explaining kind of what the options are for the person depending on their situation, I've found can help prepare them to decide what is best for their situation without actually like digging in too deep. It's like one of the things I've even prepped people for. Before they go into this process, I've even told people and then advised them, listen, it's going to be a very painful process. And the point, in a way, it's sort of baked into the psychology of shelters, that the idea is the fear and the stigma and the sort of the assumption in a lot of places, which I have reason to believe is a false understanding, is that you want to make the shelter as uncomfortable as possible so people don't stay very long. There's like this mentality out there that says you want to make it as horrible as well, not horrible, you got to make it as bare minimum as you can, because if you make it too nice, they'll never leave, and they'll never go for housing, and they'll never actually they'll be there forever. And we're trying to get them out, so we're going to try to make so. What I've even told people, I was like, knowing going into it what this process will look like, I would plead with you, no matter what your situation is going in, that you are as friendly and as patient as you can. Be overly friendly, be overly patient. even with the people who are rude to you, even with the security guard who's patting you down, even with the person that treats you badly at the intake, like if you run into that guy who's just really if you can stay the course and you can be overly friendly and patient, like and muster up all the, and Corey and I were talking about this earlier, that presupposes often a good night's sleep for most of us. That presupposes a shower. That presupposes a solid mental bandwidth to be able to face that kind of obstacle with all the mental energy and the positivity that we can. So if you're not in that situation, you're already starting at a deficit. But if I can encourage the person to say, this is what you're going to go into, and if you can be as friendly, as patient, as kind as you can with everybody that you meet,